For many things in life, there can be too much. Getting too much sun can cause heat stroke. Filling a balloon with too much water can cause it to burst. Or in my dad's case, watching too much Newsmax turns you into a narcissistic fascist. Okay, so maybe that's a bit too strong of a description of him, but he's certainly heading in that direction. At the end of the day, trying to do too much ends up making something feel bloated, and that's the case with Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, otherwise known as Gateway to Glimmer in Europe. Basically, it's an immense challenge trying to improve over the original, especially when said installment was really successful, and in order to expand upon the first game, Ripto's Rage throws everything at the wall to see what sticks. Some people accuse Year of the Dragon of doing this more, but they don't acknowledge Spyro 2 was overstuffed as well. Not in the same sense as Jak 2, the game doesn't transform itself into a different beast, but it does feel as if the new additions were tweaked and dabbled with too much, to the point most of them felt unrefined. Don't get me wrong, I did quite like Ripto's Rage, but it feels like something was lost in the process of trying to ameliorate upon the first game. I'll go into more details later on. While the story isn't the most important aspect in a Spyro game, it's worth talking about because even though Insomniac made a lot of marked improvements, they also heavily botched it in one vital area. It's the perfect encapsulation of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So the narrative opens with the Professor, Alora, and Hunter testing a new portal in their homeworld Avalar. When the two of them are struggling to figure out what coordinates to type, Hunter suggests his birthday.
Yeah, how about 22475? That's my birthday.
Now, whether that means February 24th, 1975, or April 22nd, 1975, I don't know. But the portal opens and immediately transports Ripto, Gulp, and Crush into Avalar. Ripto takes one look around and says, "No dragons? Cool, I'm moving in." As a side note, I kind of wish they explained what Ripto has against dragons, and why Hunter's birthday allowed him to come in. But then again, the first game never really explained the animosity between the dragons and the nasty Nork, so maybe I'm thinking too deep into it. Anyway, the scene switches to Spyro and Sparks suffering through a rainy day. The duo is wondering when the storm will ever let up until they see a portal that leads to Dragon Shores. However, after going in, instead of landing on the beach, they end up in Avalar, where Hunter, Alora, and the Professor plead with him to take out Ripto. Not one to turn down an offer when needed, Spyro must embark on a quest to search for the 14 Talisman and to stop Ripto from turning Avalar into Riptonia. Overall, in terms of improvements, the narrative is much more involved compared to the original. The main characters have much more defined traits. While the Dragon Elders of the first game could mostly be watered down to being really one note with barely any screen time, the main cast of Ripto's Rage not only have a better variety of anthropomorphic characters, but also have quite a few likable personalities. Alora the Fawn comes across as a motherly protector of Avalar. She has an obligation to watch over its residents, and is the one with the most visible concern when Ripto invaded. She even is kind enough to act as a guide for Spyro when he's first trying to navigate the place. However, there's some amount of tension between the two in their initial meeting, like when she gets mad at him after Spyro misrepresents her as a goat.
What are you, some kind of goat?
I'm a fawn, you dork.
Oh, sorry.
Small details like this could have been expanded upon. Maybe the in-game dialogue could have been adjusted in order to reflect that they're still getting to know each other. Considering Spyro is still new to Avalar, it would make sense that they don't 100% trust him. And this is the first issue with Ripto's Rage's story. Since it's more involved this time around, there are directions the writers could have taken, but choose not to do so, which kind of leaves a story that ended up lacking in potential character development. The same complaint could be applied to Hunter. Before Spyro's arrival, he seems to express a lot of fear with what dragons were capable of. So to see Spyro as puny and purple appears to befuddle him slightly when he first witnesses him. Furthermore, when Alora tries to task Spyro with collecting all the talisman, Hunter believes he's entitled to such job. It would have been interesting to see some sort of tension between him and Spyro, like there could have been a hint of jealousy in his dialogue every time you speak to him, but no, he warms up to you immediately. I'm not saying this affects either Alora and Hunter's likability, as Hunter is quite a fun character. His athletic ability makes him seem strong and adequate, yet at the same time, he has his dumb moments like when he forgets his running shoes, or when he doesn't attack Ripto both times they encounter each other. I guess you could say he's almost like the lion from The Wizard of Oz, considering that on the outside he appears like a force to be reckoned with, but when you get to know him, he doesn't quite have the courage to take a stand against threats. His voice actor, Greg Berger, plays a major role in selling Hunter's personality, considering he goes for a more exaggerated and hammy performance for him, which reflects how Hunter tends to be a bit of a jock. And the same can be said of how he depicts Ripto. The very angry, pissed-off voice he provides gives him a charming buffoonery that Nasty Nork was lacking in. He's almost like a dinosaur Donald Trump.
Oh, that looks so horrendous. I need to wash my eyes out.
He has a childish arrogance to him that gets agitated by the smallest of blemishes, like when Spyro singes his cape, he literally blows up. But there's one area where he fails that Nasty succeeded in, and that's creating the stakes for the story. Say what you want about Nasty Nork not being threatening, at least he actually does something to make it seem as if he was a thorn in Spyro's side by freezing all the dragons. Ripto doesn't explicitly affect the Avalar residents. He comes across as more of an annoyance than an actual evil that must be stopped. I know everybody literally talks about how his actions are limited to just changing a couple flags, but I've never heard too many people talk about the fact that this guy destroys a bridge. Yeah, that's the most evil, maniacal thing that Ripto ever does in this game. He destroys a bridge, so Spyro has to glide to get across. So threatening, am I right? In all seriousness, considering that Ripto is all talk and no action, he makes himself look inadequate most of the time. Like after you defeat Crush, he tries to send a Gulp in, but he ends up causing the entire ceiling to collapse on him in the process. Zoe indirectly owns him, which causes him to lose his scepter. I mean, I guess he is adequate at bullying moneybags, but most of the time, the greedy bear can barely put up a fight anyway, despite being a champion bantamweight boxer at university. Why does Allura keep treating Ripto as a danger again? He can barely do much of anything. I guess, granted, he does almost feed Zoe to Gulp, and that's pretty evil, but he never quite accomplished this considering Spyro saves her, so it doesn't quite count. But to go back to the voice acting, Insomniac actually did a better job at making a star-studded cast that provides flavor to the characters than the first game, which basically had Clancy Brown voice everyone but Spyro. Carlos Alazraqui gave a raspier voice to represent a younger Spyro, but Tom Kenny's smoother undertones not only gave us a more mature Purple Dragon, but also one that was ready to kick ass while not being as stubborn. It's kind of hard to see someone who voices SpongeBob to be able to deliver this kind of performance. It would have been hard to pick two and two apart for someone that didn't know any better, which kind of shows Kenny's range. I mean, would you believe me if I told you that Kenny also lent his voice to the Professor? Seriously, as someone who only knows him for SpongeBob, and maybe some of the Ratnicians from the Crash to Titans duology, I'm impressed with how he breathes life into what should have been a boring mole professor by using a nasally, high-pitched voice stereotypical for most intellectuals. Melissa Disney as Allura and Mary Linda Phillips as Zoe were also generally good in their respective roles. It's noteworthy to mention that Disney goes on to voice Courtney Gears in Ratchet & Clank 3, and it's just so bizarre seeing this somewhat conservative, motherly fawn turn into this sexualized robot chick. Wait, what did I just write?
You wouldn't like my body. It's all circuity and metallic.
And before I end up forgetting him, there's Milton James as Moneybags. Now, for a pompous bear that loves gems, James takes a noticeably subtler approach over the exaggerated voice of Berger, which is fitting because he's trying to deceive Spyro into giving up his treasure. The way he ends every moment of dialogue with, "for a small fee," kind of makes it feel like he's saying, "Oh, come on, fork over the gems. It's not that much." So overall, much of the flavor of the characterization of Spyro 2 comes from the voice acting, and Insomniac really did themselves a favor by not making everyone Clancy Brown. Besides the main cast, Ripto's Rage also introduces NPCs to the levels. However, while they do a lot to make them each feel unique with the different problems they face, their inclusions reveal the major issue of Ripto having nothing to do with the situation at hand. Granted, there's some dialogue recovered where Allura speaks about how Ripto was harassing the Avalar civilians during the little cutscenes that play before and after the level.
Recently, Ripto sent ice wizards to Crystal Glacier to kidnap Shaman Tuck. The ice builders have been sending commandos to rescue him, but they haven't been very successful. In fact, The wizards have turned all of them into big blocks of ice. I think they need someone who can turn up the heat and help them out.
But this is irrelevant because it was cut out, so there's no way of knowing Ripto was involved at all. The situations themselves are creative with how Insomniac executed them. My particular favorite was how the breeze builders and landlubbers were at war with one another, and Spyro helps both of them, which kind of makes me wonder how they'd feel if they learned he was playing both sides. But it doesn't feel related to the plot because Ripto isn't involved in any way, shape, or form. As far as I'm concerned, the residents of Avalar might as well have been suffering from these predicaments long before Ripto arrived, so Insomniac could have made it clearer with how he had a hand in this because it really needed clarity. Phew. Yeah, it sure sounds like I'm shitting on this game a lot. Overall, the story has some improvements with the characters and voice acting, but the way they handled the villain created some problems. 2 steps forward, 1 step back to sum it all up, and I can say the same for the gameplay. Now, one of the better additions is the variety of new moves Spyro has. He can hover for a brief period to get to distant ledges, he can swim underwater, he can climb, and he has a head bash. And in order for the player to make the best use of them, the platforming has become more challenging compared to the original. Insomniac went further with this new feature by placing special power-up gates that, if accessed, could give Spyro a different move, like jumping to an astronomical height, supercharging, and super flame. To unlock them, Spyro has to collect a certain number of spirit shards, which are the droplets the enemies leave behind instead of gems. Now, all this would be swell and all if it wasn't for that fat, greedy bear Moneybags. The guy not only insults you for how easy it is to dupe you, but he gatekeeps the abilities under a small fee. What's worse is that you learn each of them at different points in the game, so when you run into a situation where you need to head bash some trolls, sorry, but you can't do the task until you get the head bash ability, which you never learn until the very last hub world. This basically means that if you want to 100% the game in one go like you could in Spyro 1, well, sad to say that it's not gonna happen. In a way, Spyro 2 puts quite a bit of emphasis on backtracking in order to collect everything. Want to save the turtles from being cooked into a stew at Sunny Beach? Too bad! You're gonna have to wait until the second hub world to learn the climb ability from Moneybags. It almost feels like needless padding. And you could really see this by the fact that there are only 3 hub worlds, the second one being overstuffed with 12 levels and 2 speedways, while the third only had 4 levels and 1 speedway. Considering that each of the hub worlds are based off of the 4 seasons, it almost makes me wonder if Insomniac was planning to make a 4th hub world, but ran out of time. As for the power-up gates, it was a unique feature connecting enemy kills with gaining a new move temporarily. However, the worst part about them is that if you leave the level, it resets. So basically you have to kill all the enemies again when you go in a second time. Say you're in Sunny Beach and you have to leave in order to get the climb ability to do that one minigame with the turtles. If you didn't free out the turtles from their boxes the first time, you have no choice but to kill the respective amount of enemies all over again just to get the Super Flame Gate to unlock once more, and then start from the beginning in freeing the turtles because the level doesn't save your progress if you didn't finish the challenge. This is a real step back from the first game, because after you collected a gem from a killed enemy in the original, you didn't have to defeat them again. It was such a small but significant feature that it leaves me scratching my head, wondering why they didn't apply this for other aspects of the game besides the gems. It doesn't destroy Ripto's rage, but it did make fighting enemies a chore, and made me feel they had added an unnecessary tweak that ruined what could have been a really good feature. But besides the new moves, Ripto's Rage also introduces some additional collectibles. This fixes a big issue of its predecessor. In my Spyro 1 review, I complained the collecting became old after a while. Despite the fact it encouraged exploration and experimentation, it was all you did. Now, Spyro 2 has 4 tasks in each of the levels. One of them involves helping another NPC fix a major problem in the world, and the other 3 being Power Orb side quests. They got really creative with the orb challenges. They involve you doing stuff like trailing a seahorse on a manta ray, playing hockey against a yeti, and charging cows back into a pen for the landlubber shepherd named Bo Peep. Of course, there were a couple of those minigames that were annoying, Everyone seems to shit on the trolley minigame where you have to collect a certain amount of gears, and the alchemist minigame where you had to guide him through stone golems to get to Hunter, but at least those had a route to memorize to pull it off. I think I had more controller-tossing moments with Sunny Beach's minigame of keeping the turtles away from the stew. Seriously, what is it about the stew that draws them towards it? I know this is a bit of a nitpick and all, but could they at least explain what it is? Does the stew have a special curse that transfixes the turtle? Does it have a special aroma? And then there are the ones within the speedways. Trailing Hunter for the most part was manageable, except for paragliding through those rings in Icy Speedway. God, it's one of the most frustrating battles of attrition I've ever experienced. I think I've already been critical enough, but how could people get angry with trouble with the trolley when you had stuff like fighting stiff controls in an attempt to get through a ring while Hunter berates you every time you fail? The talisman challenges are simpler in nature. Most of them involve Spyro fixing an ailment that's plaguing the particular level. In Idle Springs, all the Tiki Men have come to life and are terrorizing the woodworkers. Therefore, Spyro needs to defeat the living Tikis in order to relieve the workers from their fear so that they can fix the doors to progress through the level. Similarly, in Fracture Hills, the stone golems have imprisoned each of the satyrs in stone, so Spyro needs to free them so that they can play their music to unveil the temple. This is where Spyro 2 really differs from the original. While Spyro 1 was more free-roaming for lack of a better word, Spyro 2 almost tends to take a more linear approach to how you progress through the level. Basically, it utilizes extrinsic gameplay over the intrinsic playstyle of the original. For those that don't know, extrinsic gameplay makes use of goals and objectives to motivate the player, while intrinsic gameplay is more geared towards atmosphere and personal development. Compared to Spyro 1, Ripto's Rage's levels feel slightly narrower and more oriented as a pathway. Now, of course there are things like the Mystery Jar that make you explore the world a little, but it does feel like something was taken away here. However, despite all that, as I said earlier, it does prevent the collecting aspect from becoming too tedious, for each of the NPCs' situations offer a different challenge to tackle. Even though most of the time the tasks amount to do this for this person and you can move forward in this level, it at least tries to be creative with how it presents it. And speaking of different challenges to tackle, each of the levels contains 1 or 2 skill points to obtain. If you accomplish a certain task, you're rewarded with an extra life butterfly for sparks and a mark to denote its completion. Basically, you have no way of knowing what these are, and they usually involve something really obscure, like destroying all the fans in Hurricos or beating a certain time in a speedway. Although, the only real reward you'll get for doing these is an epilogue. But there's still a nice extra addition that builds upon the open world foundation the first game created. But if there's one aspect where Spyro 2 definitely made a major step forward, it was the boss battles. Crush, Gulp, and Ripto put up more of a fight compared to the weak-ass battles you engaged in during the original Spyro the Dragon. Instead of chasing your foes across the map, now it's confined to an arena, and you get to fight them. So with Crush, it's just avoiding his attacks until he's vulnerable, in which case you have to close the distance to flame him. This causes him to slam his club on the ground and to make the ceiling fall on him. It's pretty straightforward, with very little variation, other than his attacks becoming faster. Gulp is more involved in the sense that you have to race against him to use different items to attack. If he gets to it first, then he'll unleash an explosion and other difficult-to-dodge moves, so you have to be quick in how you use the multiple barrels and bombs coming your way, while avoiding getting squashed by him. Ripto is similar in the sense that you'll be racing against him to collect 3 power orbs to get a special ability to deal damage to him. However, it makes a major improvement over Gulp because the fight evolves as it continues, with Ripto summoning a robotic quadruped dinosaur as well as a pterodactyl. Overall, it's a better boss fight compared to the shit nasty Nork. So once again, the gameplay of Spyro 2 has a lot of improvements going for it, but it also has some fundamental issues at the same time. However, Stuart Copeland's score helps to liven up the experience more. He nailed the OST of the first game, and he continues to shine in Ripto's Rage as well. If there was one minor complaint that I had, it would be that the hub world themes are lacking in form. I know that each of them are reflective of the seasons, and there are certain elements like the chimes representing snow in winter tundra, but it all just sort of blends together, and it doesn't feel distinct. The last thing I'll mention is the final bonus level. The first Spyro game had a Nasty's loot, which was meant to be a reward for beating the game 100%, and Spyro 2's Dragon Shores is arguably worse. This again demonstrates the extrinsic direction Spyro 2 tried to take, because instead of exploring every crook and cranny to find all the gems and keys, like in Nasty's loot, Dragon Shores was more about finishing a goal, like popping all the balloons in a roller coaster ride, or shooting down several targets. Granted, these are relaxing activities, but there's not much to do in Dragon Shores besides these minigames. Therefore, it feels watered down compared to Nasty's loot. But for all the criticism I've given, Ripto's Rage is still a solid sequel that manages to do enough to build upon the foundation of the first game while still managing to feel fresh. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't change so much that it feels alienating to the base of the original, while at the same time, it doesn't feel too familiar to its predecessor. It's just that some of the changes really were a make-or-break factor. A handful of them improved upon the experience, while others took away from the overall charm of Spyro 1. While I began to review saying Spyro 2 was overbloated, maybe to say that the game tried too much isn't a 100% accurate representation of it. It's more like they had a lot of good ideas that weren't fully refined. The minigames are varied, but some of them were frustrating to engage in. The level designs had more interesting situations to complete, but they also became more linear and straightforward this time around. The story feels much more involved, but at the same time is lacking in actual stakes because the villain doesn't really affect anything. Understandably, Insomniac was still trying to experiment with how to expand upon the first game, but it would take a third installment to fully smoothen out the rough areas. But at the end of the day, I'm sure we can all agree at least it's not Enter the Dragonfly.
Wow!